Today I'll be painting the first layer of my personal landscape. I start with the wet into wet technique, so you can see that I'm painting the sky with water first, and then I'm adding color to it so that it can fill the space of the sky. Next, I know I want the water, where the water is splashing, to be the white of the paper. So I am using the crayon resist technique. Any area that I want to stay light, like the color of the paper, I'm actually coloring. I'm pressing pretty hard with the white crayon, and I'm just filling in the splashing water of the falls. When I do this, I press pretty hard so that the wax builds up on the paper, and then when I fill the paper with the watercolor, it sort of flows around where the crayon has built up on the paper, and it won't completely cover the crayon. So I will still have the white of the paper reserved because the wax is protecting it. Next, I'm creating a wash of color to fill in the water of the falls. You can see that I mixed up a little bit of turquoise paint, and I'm actually painting it directly over where I colored with the crayon. And wherever the crayon is, it pushes the watercolor paint away. The water resists the wax of the crayon. So some areas of the water in the falls in this picture will be much lighter because the crayon is resisting the watercolor paint. Since this is the first layer of my watercolor painting, I want to make sure that I filled in a sort of base coating just to fill in the white of the paper. So you can see that the next thing I do is just go in and fill in the tree line. I'm going to use a variety of different shades of green so that you can see the different layers of the trees in the background. But I'm not adding much detail. I'm just filling in the empty space of the paper with the color and a little bit of a texture for the color of the trees. When I looked back at my reference photo, I noticed that some areas of the water had a greenish tint. I also noticed that there were some trees growing on the rocky areas of the falls, so I added a little bit of green paint as an additional layer just to fill in some areas as a reminder that I was going to put trees or bushes or foliage in those areas on the rocks, as well as to add the sort of algae tint to the water to give it a blue-green color wherever the sunlight was shining on it. Then I loaded my brush with gray and I started filling in the rocks just to give them a base coating to fill in the white of the paper. I mixed gray with a little bit of violet to give it an original shade so that it wouldn't be just a flat gray. But I'm just filling in the white of the paper so that I have a base coating of gray to paint over when I add my textures later. Next, I mixed a bit darker gray by adding a little bit more violet to add some of the shadows to the rocks and boulders inside the water and along the water's edge. I knew I was going to go back over these to add a little bit more of a rough texture later on, but I wanted to have at least the highlights and the shadows done before I stopped for the day. When I painted the rocks and boulders that were closest to me in the foreground of this landscape, I mixed an even more violet version of my gray paint so that it would give some contrast between the foreground and the middle ground of the painting. I started using a bolder color of violet, a more saturated violet color, to start adding the texture of the rocks in the foreground. Because the shadows in the foreground are more saturated or a brighter violet, it gives some strong contrast in my painting, despite the fact that there aren't a lot of details in the foreground. Next, I mixed in a little bit more gray so that I could blend the violet areas with the gray areas so it was more even. So you can see I'm using a lot of water on the brush and a bit more of the gray to sort of blend so that there wasn't such a strong difference between the light gray that I started with and the violet that I started with. The last thing I did was to paint a little bit of water over some areas of the rocks in the foreground to reveal the highlights below. I painted with water and soaked up a little bit of the water and paint with a dry paper towel. This is where I stopped for layer 1. I plan to add more texture and detail to the painting, but I want to let layer 1 dry before I add any details on top. Now it's time for you to start filling in the colors of layer 1 for your watercolor landscape painting.